Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP, Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is an opportunity for me to look at the recent Israel-Palestine events and, in fact, the conflict at large, going back historically. A look at that and those events from a philosophical and psychological point of view. I want to look at this conflict, first of all, psychologically, then philosophically. So this video will deal a little bit with my biases and then how to understand morality that might help us going forward with evaluating the morality of what both sides have done or plan on doing. So there will be that will be the foundation in this video. The next video will look at the historical timeline and the historical context of the conflict, the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then going forward, we'll look at, okay, what are the topical events that have just happened? How does that change things? How can we evaluate what each side has done? What do we even mean by sides in this conflict, so on and so forth. So we'll take hopefully what we talk about today in this video. We'll take that as a foundation and then build upon it. I have been shocked, as many people have, by the events that have taken place. First, by Hamas doing some truly despicable stuff, and we can talk about elements of propaganda being thrown in from either side, I'm sure, throughout these events. But there has at least been some terrible, terrible things that have taken place. And then I've seen Israel retaliate by doing some arguably war criminal things themselves. And so this is it's a divisive issue, of course it is, but it's a complex issue, both philosophically and politically. I have seen people I know and people around the world become polarized, going and jumping on if they have some kind of affinity with the Palestinians, whether that be through religion, oppression, or whatever, some kind of affinity with them. They jump on to the pro-Palestinian point of view and attack anything and everything Israeli. And I've seen people jump on the Israeli bandwagon and attack anything Palestinian or certainly Hamas related, but maybe wrapping up everyone in the same kind of sheet there and saying, well, they're all the bad guys, so anything Israel does is justified, and etc., etc. And we've seen this divisive polarization. And I'm going to be someone, I think, that sits in the middle and goes, it's actually a lot more complex than that, and that includes the way that we need to think about it from a philosophical and psychological point of view. Now, I'm going to start with talking about psychology because we need to be aware of our biases, right? It is super important that that we recognize when we are evaluating things in a less than perfectly objective manner. And of course, that's going to happen almost always with everybody. Everyone brings baggage to their moral evaluations. They bring baggage to how they see the world and how they evaluate the world and events. We look through everything with a lens. How distorted does that lens make the image to us? And that's the what I want to look at with myself. I want to be as accurate as I possibly can be to provide information to you that is fair as well as being accurate. It's fair because it's accurate in a sense of what has taken place, and accurate in a sense of like how we should look at it, although that will be obviously subjective as well. So I need to understand what's going on in my own head and how I might be biased myself. As I say, in order to make sure that I'm doing a fair job of that nuance, where are my biases? Let's think how I could approach this in a biased way. What sentiments are going to have that could unfairly affect my moral evaluations? So the first thing is, I am an atheist philosopher of religion, such that I have written many, many books and articles critiquing Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. In other words, like from that position, I'm actually going to favor neither Judaism or Israel qua Judaism, nor am I going to favor Palestine qua Islam, because actually, you know, I don't have a horse in that race. I'm a secular humanist, and I just want everyone to get on and love each other and live in harmony without the need to invoke God in that uh, scenario. So, okay, so there's no biases that I can see yet there. Um, let's think about Israel versus Palestine, and by Palestine, that's an interesting idea anyway, versus Gaza Strip and the West Bank. We'll talk about these areas later, versus some idea of what Palestine is, versus, you know, the, these people who are predominantly Muslim. Okay, so I've got Jewish people against Muslim people. Okay. How might I be biased here? Well, I will let you know now that I am intuitively more morally biased against Islam, because I think, and I've done presentations on this, and I've researched it previously, I've read the Quran, and I find that theologically it's more morally problematic. I know many people say it's a religion of peace. Many people say, no, it's, you know, Islamic extremism is, but, you know, whatever your positions there, I feel that morally, Islam is more troubling for me when I look at the Quran and when I look at the Hadith, right, which are the books that were written about is you know, Muhammad's sayings rather than his interactions with the Archangel Gabriel, so on and so forth. Okay. I find those problematic. However, I look at the Bible and some forms of Orthodox Judaism, and I find that fairly morally problematic. So I'm a liberal lefty who just thinks we should be socially progressive and people should be able to be who they want to be, as long as it has no moral implications on others. And I don't think I need a moral book to tell me how to interact with other people in these kind of contexts. Okay, so I look at these two and I think this is supposedly the direct word of God through Islam, through Muhammad, that turns into Islam. And this is a book that has some pretty horrific stuff in as well. But because it's written by men and it's the inspired, it's not the direct word of God, it's the inspired word of God, there's a lot of wriggle room. Okay, does that make any difference into how, as to how I interpret the events in the Palestine Israel area? Quite possibly. I might favor the Bible over the Quran and the Hadith, but actually, I've spent many books critiquing the Bible for moral reasons. Let's look at the people, modern Israelites against Palestinians. My idea of modern Israelites is that they're quite liberally progressed, but that could be a misrepresentation of who they are, because there's been quite a right-wing government under Benjamin Netanyahu, and there's a rolling back of the judiciary there, and so on and so forth. That's been problematic. But generally, when I looked at Israel, I think it's quite progressive. There are people that are quite like me and like how I morally see the world. I'm more likely to find that. And when I look at Palestine, and here's the thing, I don't know that much about the people in Palestine and what the social fabric is like there. And so I could look at something like Hamas and say that's a restrictive moral group of people. Therefore, all of Palestine is like that. And therefore, I have a problem with that because that doesn't fit well with my morality. And so then there could be areas where I am going to be biased towards Israel here on that kind of moral social compass side of things. But then there are am I cherry picking my understanding of Israel versus my understanding of Palestine and the people living in those places? So I don't know. I don't know. We'll have to see. So there could be a slight bias towards the Israeli way of life, if you like, compared to a Palestinian way of life. But I have a huge lack of knowledge about the latter, and could be cherry picking the former. Okay, so that's where I am, and you know, I guess here we have a nation or a state or a peoples, the Palestinians, who are much in need of humanitarian aid, and they are less um, they are definitely less lucky, less privileged. And the Israelis are generally a more, it seems like a more privileged society. They have things to a greater degree than Palestinians do. So how does that affect how I look at things? Do I feel more sorry for these people? And one more bias might be an ethnic bias. It might be that I, as a white, uh, who am I? I'm a white heterosexual professional male in the UK, from the UK, and working in that context, right? So when I look at Israelis versus Palestinians, do I naturally have more affinity for one group of people over another? So do I look at Palestinians going, well, they're in my out group? It's not much similar to me in terms of the way they lead their lives. And will that mean that I will have biases towards Israelis? I don't know. That could be something to be aware of as well. And so on and so forth. And we'll look at the history and see how that might inform my biases. But we all have our biases. Let's be aware of them, and that includes you as a viewer, and what baggage you are taking into your understanding. You're already what your understanding is of this conflict, and how you might evaluate actions and events through a lens that is heavily coloured by whatever biases you have at play. Okay, so I think that's the psychological stuff out of the way. Let's now do a little bit of philosophy, and then we'll end it there before going on to look at the history of the conflict in a very sort of quick video next. So I want to just do a little bit of moral explanation of at least one form of moral evaluation. Now, I'm a moral skeptic. Morality exists, but this can be, you can contest what I'm saying here, and many do. That the I'm a moral skeptic because actually I look back at 4,000 years of moral philosophy and no one agrees still, which means there isn't a clear answer, which means it's much more likely that my position is correct, which is moral skepticism. There is no morality out there. We construct morality and moral value systems inside our heads, but we're not like hitting on something that exists out there. And even something did exist out there, how would we know it? Something I'll call an epistemic barrier. There's a barrier between me and whatever abstract idea might be out there. How do I know that I've got it right? How do I know what the idea is? How do I know that I've got it right? So even if it existed, it might as well not exist, and we are still doing this subjective evaluation. So we construct morality inside in our heads, and when we agree with each other, then we form tribes of people that are like-minded, or groups of people are like-minded. And when if we're lucky enough to live in a democratically free and fair country and system, under that system, then we can look at people who most represent our moral positioning, and we vote them into power, and they represent us by being like us, or we become politicians ourselves. And hopefully they then enact laws that our justice systems can reflect in their lawmaking. And we have a system whereby our moral preferences are represented throughout society, because we have democratic power to get that done. And unfortunately, sometimes we have I've just had 8 years, or no, I've had no, sorry, 13 years, is it, of a political party ruling in a country that I don't agree with, that I don't agree. So unfortunately, there have been less people that think like me, fewer people that think like me, to vote in people that I would like rule in the country, so that my moral preferences are represented and enacted in this country. And that's just the way democracy goes, right? So hopefully we get democratic systems that are fair, that at least I get some kind of representation. I would argue that in my country at the moment, with the political systems we have, we don't have that, and I don't want to derail this conversation, but that's how I understand morality. So but in creating our own moral value system, people can do different things. You can think, right, I really believe in God, and so morality comes from God. Okay, which God? Okay, how do you know? You got that epistemic barrier. How do you know that your God that you believe in actually reflect? Are you putting your moral value system that you've already got in here onto that God and then taking it back from that God to say, well, God said this? Actually, God's just your mouthpiece and saying what you want God to say, and actually it's still coming from yourself. How do you know you've got the interpretation of what you think God says correct? How do you know you've got, as I say, the right God, the right rules, all that? So there are lots of issues with putting all your moral store in God. And you could argue that's what's going on to some degree with the Israel-Palestine conflict. There are elements of morality and the way of living that people are claiming they're getting from their God, and that can be divisive, right? And we can think about how you work that out going forward if you want a one state solution where everyone lives together. Is that viable with people who believe so differently on those things? Okay, then you have other moral value systems like just leading the good life. What does a good life mean? How do you define what the good life is? You can have a moral deontology, which is that moral rules do exist out there, like it's just wrong to lie. So Immanuel Kant said this. He had categorical imperatives. It's just categorically wrong to lie. And then you have issues where, like, well, what if you had some kids playing in your lounge and a child murderer came to your door and said, do you know where Jack and Jill are? You know they're playing in your lounge. You say, well, it's wrong to lie, so they're in my lounge, and then goes and kills the kids. Or do you go, oh, I haven't seen them today. I think they're like 100 miles that way. And then murderer walks off. So, we can come up with all these different ways of going, well, how does it work? How do these rules work, and which rule is more important than another rule? And when you have, well, that was wrong in that way, but it breaks this rule. It breaks this rule here, but actually, if I'm thinking about this rule, then I should have done that rather than shouldn't have done. So how does this all work? Or do you have moral value systems like consequentialism? So consequentialism is that the moral value of any given action is evaluated. The value comes from what it obtains, what happens as a result, as a consequence of that action. But even in that, there are loads of different flavors. I'm just going to talk about the very basic idea of consequentialism, but you can come up with loads of different intricate ways of doing these calculations, right? And that would take many hundreds of hours of videos to talk you through. The basic idea, well, say utilitarianism, which is, the most happiness for the most amount of people, right? That's the basic idea of one of the main forms of consequentialism. And a good way of trying to understand this, and it's not perfect, and we can talk about, there's so many different iterations of this, is the trolley problem. The trolley problem is that there's this big train trolley going down the tracks, and it's going to run over 5 people working on the tracks or whatever. It's going to kill 5 people, and you are stood there with a lever, and standing there with a lever, you have the ability to switch that trolley to go from killing 5 people to kill 1 person. But remember, in doing so, you are the one that's pulling that lever. In a sense, you are killing that 1 person. That 1 person wouldn't have died had you not diverted the train trolley, but you would be saving 5 people. So it turns out that about 80 to 90% of people would pull the lever so it kills 1 person rather than 5 people. And we kind of use that, whether you think this is a moral value system that A works and B is perfect, and there are different iterations of it. It's generally what we do on a daily basis. We are very morally consequent. Well, if I do that, that's going to happen, so I won't do that. That's actually psychologically what a lot of us do, irrespective of the philosophy behind it. Okay, but then there are different versions of this. So I'm going to talk to you through 2 versions to see how it becomes problematic if this is just how you're going to run your life. So the trolley is going to go and kill these 5 people. But you are standing on a bridge. You're on quite thin, right? And if you threw yourself off the bridge, it would run over you and those 5 people. So you can't commit suicide. But standing next to you is someone of sufficient size, right, that if you push them, and you know this 100%, if you push them off the bridge, it would stop the trolley. It would stop that train. It would kill them, and the 5 people would survive. But so it's exactly the same calculation, but instead of pulling a lever, you're literally pushing a human, and it's the same thing. You are killing that human, but there's much more of a psychological connection between that pushing someone And it turns out that if that's a thought experiment, which is the same calculation, but just you're pushing a human rather than pulling a lever, those percentages change. So about 80 to 90% of people would not push someone off. So that is to say that there's a lot of psychology involved in moral decision making. Okay, we're going to look at one more little thought experiment, which is, and this you'll understand why this is so important later, because I've been having arguments with people about what has been taking place, and people have used these kind of moral evaluations in a way that makes me want to question them in these following sorts of ways. So here's another way of questioning that way of doing things. So the pure utilitarian understanding of this form of morality would be that if a healthy person, this person dressed in white here, if a healthy person walks into a hospital, a doctor comes up and say, "Oh, you're healthy. Hey, Jim, you're healthy. I'm going to take you and I'm going to kill you and use all of your organs to allow 5 people to live. So I'm saving 5 people's lives by killing you." How would you feel if you were the person walking into the hospital? In other words, how would you feel if you're the fat man, the larger, the big-bodied man here, or woman? How would you feel if you're the healthy person? So on the one hand, we can sit back and say, I would kill one person to save 5. That's fair enough. What if that person was you? That was the one person. What if it was your daughter or your son or you, member of your family, or your best mate? How does this affect that calculation? Because I can walk into a hospital and think, imagine I was healthy, right? And I walked into hospital and think, well, yeah, actually, it would be better for society if I died now and these 5 people survived. But do I want to die? No. Like I can make that decision for someone else, right? Yeah, I'm happy for someone I don't know in another country to be killed to make 5 people live. Yep, fair enough. I can just about psychologically excuse that. I'm not saying I can, but just imagine. But me or my partner? No, I'm not happy with that. I'm not cool with that. So it's really worth thinking of these different sorts of ways of understanding this moral calculation. So a lot of people would be happy to pull a lever, but not be happy to either kill someone to harvest their organs or be the person to be killed. So there's these thought experiments are fraught with issue, and there's a lot of psychology involved. Now, why this is important is because we are going, as I said, we are going to be thinking about, well, how did, say, Israel react to this? Well, they need to kill Hamas. Well, if they have to kill like 1,000 civilians in order to kill like 10 Hamas, how do we feel about that? How do we feel about those people being used instrumentally? So this is people being used as a means to an end. Is there any other way we could have done this? Does it have to be that 1,000 civilians died for those 10 Hamas to die? So our moral calculation should have bearing over how we see either Israel reacting, or how we see Hamas, or how we see Palestinian people, and understanding that all of these people, Hamas are humans, the civilians in these Palestinian territories are human, Israelis are human. All of these are humans, but some of them we might like a little more than others. And again, it's understanding our biases as why that might be, and then looking at their actions and say, well, actually, that's heinous. And then understanding that there's going to be an element of retribution going on in our own, like, oh my God, that's so disgusting. And we'll be talking about a lot about this because there are stories coming out of horrors that might not be true. And they might be generated so that they create in the people hearing these stories such a visceral hatred for the other side that it justifies doing terrible things to them. Right. And this will mess around with our moral calculus. So much to consider there. Anyway, I hope that's the foundations. It's really simplistic. There's so much more to morality. My goodness. But I think just dipping in here and there to some of these ideas will help us try and get our heads around what's going on in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Anyway, thank you so much. Hopefully that was of use. As I always say, please like, subscribe, and share, and do all that kind of YouTubey stuff. And I'll be back with you for the next video shortly.